Thumbs up, thank you very much. If ransomware was a company, let's call it Ransomware PLC, then its earnings report for last year made grim reading for us, but great reading for them. An 84% increase in customers attacked, and Wall Street would be absolutely delighted that they reached the milestone of $1 billion run rate in ransoms paid. What the numbers tell us, what the data shows us, is that this threat, this attack vector, isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's only getting worse. And that's why we're here today, to talk to you about how we can help build resilience against ransomware using AWS Storage. Let me start with the introductions to today's cast and crew. My name is Tom. I am a solution architect focused on our global financial services customers here at AWS.
Thank you, Tom. Hopefully you can all hear me well. Today, I'll be sharing insights on a multi-layered backup architecture that logically isolates your entire recovery options and ensures fast and reliable recovery. By the end of this session, hopefully, you'll understand how to proactively mitigate ransomware and ensure business continuity. My name is Sabit Venkatajalapati. I'm a worldwide solutions architect, part of the AWS backup team. Welcome again, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Now, I've got a bit of a sore throat, so can everyone hear me at the back? Excellent. So my name's Richard Bignell. I'm a security architect at Santander. I'm going to start off with a show of hands. So who in the audience is a Santander customer or has a friend that's a Santander customer? That's actually more than I thought.
We're working on it.
A few technical difficulties with the slide.
Technical difficulties, ladies and gentlemen. Bear with us. PowerPoint never works when you need it. Oh, there we go.
There you go. Can everyone see that now? I couldn't see it change on my screen. Now, Santander started in the UK as National Building Society in 1849, and merged with Abbey Building Society in 1944, and acquired by Banco Santander in 2004. Now, the point I'm making here is that Santander have been around a long time. This has meant that we can not operate like a startup or a cloud-only organization. It can be difficult changing old-fashioned mindsets or freeing ourselves from what I can only refer to as baggage. Now, I'm sure some of the audience can relate to working for a long-standing organization. This can obviously affect your ability to scale, but can also, maybe more importantly, affect your ability to protect yourself against cyber threats like ransomware. Now, the good news is the fixes are relatively simple and straightforward. And in true AWS style, most of those services are pay-as-you-use. Now, at Santander, we treat security as the most important pillar of the well-architected framework to make sure that we're protecting our customers. Now, I'm going to come back at the end and tell you a little bit about how we do this at Santander. But first, I'm going to hand over to Tom, who's going to tell us a little bit about how to build resilience against ransomware using AWS Storage.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Hold on to your hats. There we go. We're good to go. Before we begin, if you are familiar with the AWS learning levels between 1 and 500, this is going to be a 300 level session, which means we're going to flip between about intermediate and advanced topics around some thought leadership, some best practices, but more importantly, some solution architectures. Now, I have heard that people like to take photos of their food and post it on Instagram. I get the feeling this is more of an audience that likes to take pictures of architectures and post them on LinkedIn. Now, to save you having a camera roll of half-built architectures, if you wait until you see the camera icon, top right, as those architectures will be built out, it means you'll get that perfect picture and all the likes. The phrase that is doing the rounds at the moment around ransomware is it's not a case of if, but when. As you heard me talk about earlier, the numbers are showing us that this threat isn't going anywhere, and if anything, it is increasing. And that's why we need to look at strategies around resilience, should the worst case happen. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We'll take a look at the ransomware threat landscape, the role of backups, the role of backup policies, and for me, the most important aspect of all of this is recovery strategies. Now, whether you're just starting out on your IT career or you are slightly more tenured, hopefully during that time, you bump into a couple of data points that are just kind of rock solid, things that you carry with you. And one of the things I first started out with was when someone was talking about backup and they said, actually, it's all about the restore. You can back up your mainframe to a bunch of post-it notes if you want to, but how useful, how relevant is that if you actually have to do a restore? Relevant to the business, to the services, to the applications that are dependent on it. It's all about the restore. And then after that, we'll do a very brief call to action and try and get you to fill out a survey before you all run out for snacks. So the ransomware threat landscape. You can see the bar chart of that unfortunate ransomware run rate of $1 billion in terms of ransoms paid. What that doesn't cover, however, is the reputational damage. Once you've fixed the problem, customer impact and the resounding news that follows that. Reputational damage can be in the many more billions of dollars. But it's the other two numbers that I'm interested in. And what I'd liken this to is, imagine you're sitting on the sofa. Everything is fine with the world, and suddenly you feel a drip on your head. You look up, and there is that big brown water stain, and you know exactly where that drip is coming from. That's what these two numbers are saying. By the time you felt the drip, the damage is already being done. Now what you have to do is move to try and recover to make sure that disaster doesn't follow. We don't want the roof caving in. Now, financial services are leading the way on this. And I know it's tempting at this point, if you're not in financial services, it's not your vertical, it's not your area of interest, to check your phone for emails and messages at this point. But bear with me for 30 seconds. What the regulators are doing and what governing bodies across the world are looking at and understanding is that financial services are interconnected. As we saw from the financial crisis, what affects one bank has a ripple effect across the whole environment, across the whole banking ecosystem. There is now legislation and guidance coming from the regulator and from governing bodies to say that banks, financial service institutions, must be able to recover their operational environment should the worst happen. Now, I'm paraphrasing thousands of pages of documentation, which I encourage you to try not to read after this session. But if I take out the words financial services and regulators and just say there is a move to make sure that all organizations are resilient and can bring back their operational environment should the worst case happen, that's just good common sense. It's all about the recovery. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework, that's had an update as recently as February this year to 2.0. The main one being the govern element that you can see just at the bottom that kind of encapsulates all the others, and that focuses on policy, executive leadership, governance around that framework. But what we're seeing customers massively move to is that recovery aspect. And so what I mean by this is, just imagine you're in the worst case scenario. Things have gone horribly wrong, your environment has fallen down, and you're now standing in front of the CEO. And they say to you, now what? And you've got two options, two answers. I'm 100% sure I know how they got in, but I'm not entirely sure I can recover the business. Or I'm 75% sure I know how they got in, and I'll figure that out in the next 48 hours while I bring the business back. Now, clearly we want the safe, comfortable third option, which is they never got in, and I can absolutely recover the business. And I know the examples are a little extreme, but you can just see the importance on focusing too heavily on one aspect when it comes to ransomware. We need to be able to recover the business, otherwise there's nothing to do. So what are the bad actors doing? Well, they all pretty much have the same motive. They're after coin, usually Bitcoin. They're in it to make money. Their means and methods are pretty much the same, give or take: land and expand. Then once they're in and all their hard work is about to pay off, they will detonate that ransomware. Now, if this is a big attack, if this is a well-structured attack, what they also know is that your backups are your first line of defense in not paying them for all of the good work that they have done. So they are going to go after your backups. They know this, they are not stupid. So if we want to get back to a point of post-attack recovery where the business is working properly, we need to understand the role of backups, because if we don't, there is the potential for data loss. And we'll zoom in on that data loss aspect now. So I'm going to take you back to that sofa. But this time you've got your favorite snacks, and you're binge watching your favorite television show. As far as you're concerned, everything's all right with the world. But the threat has been introduced. The leak has started. It's starting to infiltrate. It's starting to make its way through your environment. It's not until you feel that drip on your head do you know that something is going wrong in your infrastructure. Then you want to do something about it. You want to start to respond. You want to mitigate that threat. So we start to put the response aspect in, so that as we start to mitigate that threat, we start to return to normal operations. Now, what you may have noticed down at the bottom are the backups. As soon as that threat landed that you weren't aware of, there is a risk that those backups were contaminated. They were infected. That means we now have the potential for business loss, for data loss inside the environment before we reach a point of normal operations. That is why backups are absolutely crucial in terms of the role of risk mitigation.
Thanks, Tom. A well thought through backup and recovery strategy is key for ensuring you've got a proper ransomware mitigation strategy in place. To build a truly resilient backup and recovery strategy, you need to start with the structured approach of threat modeling. Adam Shostak's 4-question framework is an excellent tool for this purpose. Let's walk through each question and understand what it really means. First of all, we have to start with the question of what are we working on? Define the scope of what are you trying to protect on. This would be your backup and recovery systems. That could be your last line of defense. Then we ask the next question of what can go wrong. What are the threats, vulnerabilities, and attack vectors that could compromise your backup and recovery? That's what we will be focusing here. Then we have to understand the next question. What are we doing about it? What are the threat mitigation strategies that you're trying to implement so that the threats that you've identified in the previous step could be mitigated against? This would be your logically air gap backups, your restore testing that could also allow you to recover properly. But that's not all of it. We need to always keep asking the question, are we doing a good enough job? The continuous evaluation of the threat modeling exercise that you're trying to do to ensure the plan that you've put in place is actually indeed adaptable to the changing threat landscape. So by answering these 4 questions, you will be able to build a truly resilient backup strategy that could help you mitigate against ransomware attacks. So in a sense, the threat modeling is a structured approach of identifying, analyzing, and mitigating the threats that would compromise your recovery strategies. So now let's look at the importance of securing your backups in this entire puzzle. Envision a 14-day retention period where you have taken daily backups, and that's being kept for the 14-day period. These clean backups in the color of blue is your safest recovery period the moment you have detected a compromise and you want to start a restore. But imagine a situation 7 days later, a malware makes it to your source system, compromising all of your endpoint detection systems, and this malware component kind of replicates into your backups as well. This is the period where you can still do a surgical fix to your recovery options, provided your backup scanning software can exactly pinpoint what the compromises are in your backup. If not, there's no way of doing a surgical fix. And given that this fix was undetected for the next 3-day period, the malware detonates and starts encrypting your data. This is the period when your backups also gets encrypted because the source was encrypted, and your backups get encrypted because there was primarily a copy of it. This is the period where your entire recovery options become depleted because there's no way you could recover using the compromised backups. There's two important markers in this timeline: the point of compromise and the point of your last good known backup. The wider the timeline between your last good known backup and your point of compromise, the more data you stand to lose, and the more depleted your recovery options become. So the key components of trying to think through a proper recovery strategy is to ensure 3 different components are being considered. One is your backup frequency, your backup retention policies, and the pace at which you could detect a compromise in your backups. These 3 components are really essential in ensuring your backups can be your last mile of defense. So now let's look at the industry standard approach of securing your backups. The 32110 strategy is an industry approach of securing your backups by defining a particular way of creating multiple copies of your backup. The key elements of this strategy is 3 different copies of your backup, including the primary data source. So which means that you have got your primary data source. It could be your S3 bucket, your EBS volume, your RDS databases, and then you keep 2 different copies of your backup. Out of these 2 different copies of backup, you should ideally be keeping these 2 backups in 2 different storage mediums. But the best strategy to look at it is to make sure that at least one of these copies is across an account logical boundary. So in the event of an account compromise, you still be able to recover from the second copy that you have across the account boundary. One backup copy out of all these things has to be in a separate region. This copy will help you become resilient against your primary AWS region being compromised or going down. One of these backup copies has to be kept in an immutable storage, but I would say keep all of your backup copies in an immutable storage so that not even people with administrative access can compromise your backups and thereby jeopardizing your recovery options. That's not all of it. You have to continuously evaluate the recoverability of your backups. So the 0 here mentions about being able to test your recovery options without any kind of compromises in it, be it your backup storage compromises or your application storage compromises. This is where capabilities like restore testing has been called out by regulations like DORA, NYDFS, and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0. So in a sense, the multiple copies of your backups and the regular testing of your backups gives you that resilient architecture, so that like the defense in depth strategies that you can employ in terms of ensuring you've got a proper recovery mechanisms in place. Now let's hear it from Tom on how to implement effective backup policies.
So one of the questions I get asked quite frequently by customers, almost guaranteed when we start talking about ransomware protection and recovery, is what are other customers doing? It's a good question because we want to get off on the right foot. We don't want any false starts. Now, in response to those questions, we came up with some starting points. And the 2 that I want to focus on during this session are what needs to be vaulted and what does recovery look like. Now, the other points are around people and processes, executive sponsorship, management, etc. And more than happy to talk about those at a later date. But with regards to these 2, it really depends who you're talking to, the last meeting they just came out of, and what time of day it is as to the priority of either of these. Fundamentally, we need to understand what the minimum viable company, the minimum viable business is. So I have a customer, global in scale, and they did a survey of their estate, and they found they had 100,000 services and applications. They managed to narrow that down to 50 services and applications that were critical to the business. Now, that doesn't mean the other 99,950 weren't going to be backed up and wouldn't be restored at some point. But when we talk about what needs to be vaulted, we're not talking about everything instantly. What we're talking about is getting the business up and running should the worst case scenario happen. Now, if you have 100,000 applications and services, what we like to call a problem that you may encounter is analysis paralysis. Where do I start? What do I do? How do I move? Everything's crucial. Everyone's shouting at me. Where do I go? And this is where we need to be absolutely crucial and understanding that we can generate a baseline. And what this baseline is not all 100,000 applications and services. It's the core applications and services that get that business running. Why do we need to get to this baseline? Because if we don't, we're at risk. If we do not have a recovery procedure on the board, we have a risk window where if we are attacked, we cannot recover. I take you back to your previous conversation with the CEO. We know exactly what happened, but we can't bring the business back. Now, once we understand the business, the organization, the recovery procedures, the minimum viable business, etc., then we can start to move on that maturity model. We can start to think about how we start to bring in increased features, how we want to move the organization forward as we go through. So the question then naturally is, what does AWS have to help our customers with this journey?
Thanks, Tom. So I would like to introduce you, or even reintroduce to you, AWS Backup. AWS Backup is a fully managed policy-based service that allows you to centralize and automatically organize your data protection across your AWS environments and hybrid workloads. So in essence, AWS Backup allows you to work backwards from your data protection strategy requirements and define simple plans and policies that will help you create schedules and retention policies for your backups and be available to protect your data, your backups as such. As of September 2023, over 130,000 customers trust AWS Backup for their data protection needs to protect over 1.8 exabytes of data. So in essence, AWS Backup have kind of simplified the entire data protection landscape by allowing you to simply define policies and strategies and leave all the undifferentiated heavy lifting to AWS Backup as a service. A key concept of AWS Backup is the notion of AWS Backup Vault. It's a logical container that allows you to group together your recovery points so that you can manage them as a single entity. The way to look at it is, if you've got a particular data classification requirement in your organization, you would be having backups of these particular classified resources, and you could have them grouped inside a single vault. And these vaults could be multiple in nature based on the classification that we talked about. So, and then you would be able to apply different data retention strategies or data access strategies on this vault. And the good thing about AWS Backup Vault is that by using a simple configuration, you can extend the immutability of your already immutable AWS Backup recovery point to be WOMP compatible, like write once, read many compatible, which means that even a user with administrative privileges in your organization cannot drop your recovery points. And with the AWS Backup Vault notion, you could create these backup vaults across multiple accounts and regions, and you could be able to strategically copy the recovery points from one vault to another vault to enable the 3-2-1-1-0 strategy that we talked about earlier. And on top of this one, AWS Backup Vault also allows you to define what we call the data corridors. So if you've got a particular way of movement of your data within your organization to ensure that there's no risk of data exfiltration, the vault access policy that you define at the vault level is something that you can use to implement what we call the data corridors. At AWS, we continuously listen to our customers, and we would be innovating on your behalf. So back in 2023, during Green1, we announced the public preview of a groundbreaking new type of vault called the AWS Backup Logically Air Gap Vault. The AWS Backup Logically Air Gap Vault is currently in public preview. It's currently in public preview which means that you can still sign up for the public preview and then get access to it and try it out in the US East 1 region. What AWS Backup Logically Air Gap Vault does is to bring in two major changes to the vault concept. One is that whenever you provision an AWS Backup Logically Air Gap Vault, you can only provision an by default compliance mode immutable vault, which means that any recovery point that you try to store in this Logically Air Gap Vault are immutable by default. And the next change was the introduction of something we call as a service own key, or the AWS managed but service own key, in which the recovery points that you store inside a Logically Air Gap Vault will be encrypted using a service own key. So one of the threat vectors that most of our customers are concerned about is the compromise of the AWS KMS keys. So because this KMS key is actually owned by the service and granted to customers to use, they don't have there's no option of compromising your KMS keys. The second and the most powerful feature of AWS Backup Logically Air Gap Vault is the integration with AWS Resource Access Manager. With the integration, you will now be able to share the contents of Logically Air Gap Vault in one account with any other AWS account of your choice within the same region. So if you could recall previously, if you had to copy the recovery points from one vault to another vault, the requirement was to have both of these vaults in the same AWS organization. But now with the introduction of AWS RAM, you can share the contents of the Logically Air Gap Vault with any other account of your choice in the same region. That kind of simplifies your entire RTO experience without requiring you to initiate a copy before doing the restore. So that simplifies your entire RTO experience. And we will later look at how this simplifies this larger forensic analysis in a reference architecture. The other major capability that we launched during reInvent 2023 was what we call the AWS Backup Restore Testing. With AWS Backup Restore Testing, you can define simple restore plans that could automate the recoverability testing of your recovery points. So as stipulated by regulations like DORA, which is almost around the corner, and NYDFS and NIST CSF 2.0, you are required to regularly test and validate your recovery points. So you're not just validating the recoverability of your recovery points, but also ensuring that you have a proper understanding on the timelines required to recover any of these recovery points, so that they can feed into your larger recovery runbooks and all those things. Now that we have looked at the role of backups, the importance of backup policies, and the newer capabilities, let's look at how all these things are put together in a reference architecture. So at the center of all those things is your AWS organization, in which you have provisioned multiple AWS accounts in which workloads will be run, for which backups will be taken for. But the major capability of AWS organization integration is that you can implement the principles of defense in depth and the principles of least privileges by integrating on concepts like SCPs, delegated admin account, and a key vault account. So the use of a key vault account is to ensure you kind of apply the principles of defense in depth to provision a KMS key in a separate key vault account to be shared with any other AWS account of your choice to be used. The need of doing that one is to ensure that in the event of your original account being compromised, if you're keeping your recovery points immutable, you cannot be compromised because your keys are being stored in a separate secure account. Envision that you have got multiple AWS workload accounts in which you're running your storage workloads for which local backups are being taken using backup plans and policies. This becomes your first copy that we are talking about, or the second copy because your service data will be your primary copy. And then following the principles of defense in depth, you're provisioning a separate data bunker account in your AWS organization in the same AWS region, and in which the Logically Air Gap Vault is being provisioned into. Then you set up a plan step to have the recovery points copied into the central bunker account. This now becomes your second copy. You can also very well provision a bunker account in a different region of your choice in the same AWS organization, and you can initiate copies into this particular Logically Air Gap Vault bunker account. This becomes your third copy. That's not all of it. Remember the zero that we talked about? You can always provision a separate forensic account in which you can initiate your recovery testing, and your forensic analysis. And we've got a partner solution from elastio.com, which can perform malware and ransomware analysis on your data, be it it's on EBS volumes, S3 buckets, FSX drives, and all of it. So now that we looked at a reference architecture on keep creating backups and protecting the backups, let's look at how to think about recovery in the context of using these backups. So a successful ransomware recovery actually requires a well thought through plan. Without a well thought through plan, there's no way you could be starting a recovery exercise when you're being hit by a compromise. The first and foremost step in this one would be to start with a comprehensive risk assessment, understanding the threats that you want to protect against, the compromises that could happen in a system that can hamper your recovery exercises. And then you start with your data protection and backup strategies. This is actually an opportunity for you to work backwards from your risk assessment outputs to define what you're wanting to backup, how you want to backup, how you secure your backups and all these things. Then you need to have a proper incident response plan to ensure there is a proper communication channel in the event of a particular compromise happening, so that appropriate communication channels are opened and then being utilized. Obviously, there's a requirement of collaboration and coordination, so that it's not just the role of the backup team or the data protection team to initiate the recovery. It has to be a thought-through combination of business and IT working together to initiate the recovery. And nothing is complete without the appropriate training of your organization to ensure they can execute this plan in place. And like I always mentioned earlier, a continuous improvement plan has to be put in place, so that based on the changing threat landscape, you need to continuously evolve and adapt your risk assessments and then apply back into your organization. So I want to touch base on one final recovery concept here. So a proper recovery exercise requires you to think through the critical path of recovery. You might be having thousands of applications in your organization. Not every application need to be recovered on day one or the point T0, because not every application is required for the minimal functionality of your organization. So that's when you have to understand the critical path in which you can recover, because every organization, every cloud service provider, or be it your on-premises system, has got limitations on how much provisioning of resources can you do when you think about a recovery. Even if you have backups of all of your 1,000 VMs, you might not be able to execute the 1,000 VM recovery parallelly. So what it requires you to start with the essence of the clean backups that you've already protected, and then think through the initial foundational services that you would want to recover first. Once you have recovered your foundational services, you will have to then think about what the associated services that function on the foundational services, that is still the core of your application recovery. Once you've got your foundational services recovered and the associated services recovered, or the dependent services recovered, you have to then initiate the recovery of your most critical applications. This is what we call as the minimum viable company. This is the core components in your organization that has to be stood up to make sure that your organization can function, even if it's at a very restricted manner, but that could restrict the damage of your reputational loss. And once you're done with this phase one of recovery, that's when you can slowly think about how the recovery would look like, and then initiate the recovery of all of your other services, and finally completing the full recovery of your services. Now that we've looked at what to back up, how to back up, the importance of securing your backups, how to think about recovery options and all these things, let's see how this is all put together in a reference architecture. We talked about a workload account. These can be in any numbers. We have got customers who have got few tens of AWS accounts in which they run their workloads, to thousands of AWS accounts in a single AWS organization. You've got backup plans and policies that define local recovery points that could be used to recover from fat finger errors. So provided you make a mistake on your data, unwanted deletions and all those things, you could always use the local copy to do a restore. Then we talked about a vault account in which you kind of secure a copy of your backup. The need of this particular recovery point is to be able to recover your minimum viable company in the event of individual source accounts being compromised. Then we talked about a forensic account in which you can perform all of your forensic analysis and recovery testing so that these don't clash with your production workloads. And with the integration of partner solutions like the one from elastico.com, you could seamlessly execute all of your ransomware and malware scans. This ties back into the earlier point that Tom was talking about. If you are wanting to be notified of a water drip earlier, you should be testing it regularly, like a water leak detector kind of a thing that has been already deployed in your house. And when you're thinking about a recovery, you could always provision a separate account, a clean account in your AWS organization, and kind of get a logical air gap vault shares to be initiated recovery. This is what a reference architecture would look like. But let's hear it from Rick on how Santander have thought through this particular exercise and what they've done on this one.
Thanks, Abith. So at Santander, we run our cloud-based applications on what we refer to as the SLZ, or the Santander Landing Zone. Now, the Santander Landing Zone is effectively an infrastructure as code vending machine to make sure that we vend to application teams to use. Now, all of these application accounts that are vended each get the necessary guardrails and controls that we need to make sure that we're meeting regulatory compliance and give us that defense in depth. So I'm going to refer to the diagram. The cloud administrator, top left, has access through their AD credentials to a management account. That management account has backup policies that are vended to the application account. Now, within the application account, the application owner has access to that account, but also has access to use tags to make sure that they're backing up into the vault only what they need to. Tom was covering earlier that you don't necessarily want to back up all of your services into the vault. You back up your critical services. So you tag the resources that you want in that vault. Now look there at the bottom, we've got the KMS key that's vended with that account. That's a separate KMS key per account, and that's used to encrypt the data in that vault. Once the data's in the vault, as Sabitha was covering, it's immutable. What we also do to make sure that we're covering all bases is do a secure copy over to a logically separated account. Now that logically separated account has separated access from what we call the break glass user. Now that break glass user doesn't use AD credentials to log into that account. It uses separate credentials, but maybe more importantly, uses MFA on top of that. Make sure I've got the right slide on the screen. Just going to cover a few of the key ransomware takeaways. Now, as I was covering your critical applications, you need to make sure that you've got that list. Now, the list of critical applications comes from your business impact assessment. The business impact assessment not only generates that list of critical applications, but also how tightly coupled they are, to make sure that when you're restoring your services, they restore what's called that minimum viable company. That minimum viable company is obviously the services that are coupled together to restore your services. Now, another tip is to make sure, as Sabitha was covering, that you test the restore of those backups. Did you know that 70% of ransomware victims that were interviewed either said that they could not restore from their backup because it hadn't been tested, or because the backup was also compromised? So make sure that you're testing that backup. But also make sure that when you're testing that backup, scan it for vulnerabilities when it comes out as part of that testing. Even automate the process of recovery, scanning, to make sure that you haven't got any vulnerabilities in the backup itself. So you can scan on the way in, you can scan on the way out when it comes out as part of that testing. But also make sure that you're obviously scanning all of your live systems for vulnerabilities and patching anything that you find as quickly as possible, especially those critical vulnerabilities. Now lastly, the most important tip is make sure that you cover staff training. Now that's not training your security staff, that's training all of your staff on security issues. Most of the ransomware attacks that I've read about could have been prevented with basic staff training. And at Santander, we cover this with mandatory training to make sure that all of our staff get the necessary security training. For example, something as simple as handling suspicious emails with links. Now, if you've got any other questions about anything that I've covered today, reach out to your AWS account team, who I'm sure will be more than happy to help. I'm going to hand over to Tom for a final summary.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. So just to finish off, I know your free snacks and socks are waiting for you outside, and I want to get you out of here on time. They're not going to collect themselves. So just some key takeaways. And there's no rocket science here, absolutely not. But you've understood, we need to understand, what does recovery look like? It's not all 100,000 services and applications. It's the minimum viable company. It's the minimum viable business. That's what you need to get done within the first 24 to 48 hours. Everything else, it can wait, quite frankly. Plan and prepare for a worst case scenario. It's all very well and good doing the 3 p.m. in the afternoon, bad coffee and snacks, role play. But how does your recovery actually work at 3 o'clock in the morning during the summer holidays when half your staff are not available? You do not want to be planning for recovery on the fly with your phone ringing off the hook. What does it look like in terms of a worst case scenario? Iterate, test, and validate your recovery. It's fine if this doesn't work. Because if it doesn't work, you can go away and understand why it didn't. It may not have worked because the business changes. What you did 6, 12 months ago may now not be relevant. The business moves, the application moves, the use case moves. There may be procedures in your organization you weren't aware of. Understand what they are, feed that back. Communication. And finally, cyber resilience is a business problem. There is a tendency to look upon the technologists, the backup and restore team, and say, well, they've got a backup, it's their responsibility to bring it back. To a degree, absolutely. But they also don't know if they've backed up the Office folder, whether they've got all of the Office party photos in there, or whether they've got the invoices that keep your business moving the following day and keep cash flowing through the organization. It needs communication, it needs the business, it needs executive sponsorship, it needs coordination, as you've seen, to make sure that when a recovery needs to happen, it can happen quickly. Now, I know this slide is your instant get up and go, but bear with me for 30 seconds. Please try out Skill Builder. I never met 600 free training courses that I didn't like. It's not going to hurt. You don't have to pay for all the stuff on there. But more importantly, please use your phones to fill out that survey for 2 very good reasons. The first one is, if you'd like to see us back on stage again next year, we absolutely need to convince the Summit team that we were worthwhile, and that's in your hands. The second thing is, we absolutely want the bragging rights in the office next week. Now, I'm prepared to do things that will ruin my reputation to absolutely get those survey results in. Please come and see me after the show. But until then, your free socks, snacks, and bouncy balls await for you. Thank you very much for joining this session, and goodbye.